They laughed before she even reached the table, and Natalie Brooks knew the sound was meant to make her smaller. The Pierce Meridian Charity Gala glittered above Manhattan like a room built for people who believed money could soften every cruel edge. Crystal chandeliers poured blue-white light over the Grand Meridian ballroom, champagne moved in slim glasses from tray to tray, and the city beyond the tall windows looked distant enough to forgive anything done inside. Natalie entered alone in a simple navy dress, the kind of dress that did not ask to be noticed but made elegance feel effortless. No diamonds at her throat. No publicist at her side. No man guiding her through the crowd as proof that she still belonged. She paused near the entrance while an attendant checked her name, and for one quiet second her eyes moved to the glowing Pierce Meridian logo above the stage. She looked at it longer than anyone else would have noticed. Then she lowered her gaze and walked forward. At the VIP table near the front, Caleb Turner saw her first. His hand stopped halfway to his cufflink, and the smile he had been wearing for an investor tightened at the corners. He was still handsome in the polished way ambition teaches a man to be: black tuxedo, perfect posture, a watch expensive enough to turn every handshake into a statement. Beside him sat Brianna Cole, his fiancée, wrapped in pale gold silk and the easy confidence of a woman who believed she had inherited every room he entered. Brianna followed Caleb's stare and found Natalie crossing the ballroom. Her smile changed instantly. It sharpened. She leaned toward the guests around the table, but not so softly that Natalie could miss it. "Some divorced women never learn when the story is over," she said. A low laugh moved through the table, uncertain at first, then warmer when no one objected. Caleb looked down at his cuff link again. He did not defend Natalie. He did not even pretend not to hear. That silence landed more cleanly than Brianna's insult. Natalie had expected it, and expectation did not make it painless. A waiter guided her to a seat several tables back from the stage, close enough to see every face at the VIP table, far enough to remind her where they believed she belonged. Her place card read Ms. Natalie Brooks in clean black script. She touched the edge of it with one finger, then sat with her back straight and her clutch resting neatly in her lap. Around her, conversations resumed, but the glances remained. Former colleagues. Investors who had once shaken her hand only after Caleb introduced her as his wife. Women who remembered the divorce as gossip instead of grief. Brianna lifted her glass and tilted her head toward Natalie with a bright, pitying expression. "I admire the courage," she added louder this time. "It must be hard watching people move on while you are still trying to be included." More laughter. A man at the table covered his smile with his napkin. Someone else murmured something about awkward timing. Natalie did not blush. She did not stand. She did not answer. She simply unfolded her napkin and placed it across her knees with the careful calm of someone who had survived worse than a room full of borrowed confidence. On stage, Margaret Sloan, the event chairwoman, stepped to the microphone and welcomed the guests to an evening honoring social enterprise, leadership, and the future of ethical investment. The words floated through the ballroom with polished warmth. Natalie listened, her face composed, while Brianna continued smiling at the reaction she had created, and Caleb avoided looking at the woman who had once helped him build the pitch deck that brought him his first investor. At the front of the room, an empty chair remained beside the nameplate for Jonathan Pierce, Chief Executive Officer of Pierce Meridian Group. The chair had not yet been filled. No one at Caleb's table seemed worried. They were too busy enjoying the easy story they had chosen for Natalie. Divorced, discarded, invited by mistake, still standing too close to a life that had moved on without her. Natalie looked once more at the empty chair near the stage, then lowered her eyes to the glass of water in front of her. The ice had barely begun to melt. Her hand was steady when she lifted it. The laughter around her was real, but it was not heavy enough to hold her down. Not tonight. Not in this room. Not when the one person who knew exactly who she was had not yet stood up. Long before the gala lights made her look like an outsider, Natalie Brooks had been the woman standing closest to the beginning. She remembered Caleb Turner before the tailored tuxedos, before the investor dinners, before people said his name as if it had always belonged beside words like founder, and visionary. Back then, he lived in a small walk-up apartment in Queens where the radiator hissed too loudly, the kitchen window faced a brick wall, and every bill on the counter seemed to arrive with worse timing than the last. Caleb used to sit at the table with both hands in his hair, staring at spreadsheets he did not fully understand, convinced the company would die before anyone important learned its name. Natalie would make coffee at midnight, pull a chair beside him, and begin again. She rewrote the proposal language so nervous ideas sounded like strategy. She rebuilt the revenue model when his projections leaned more on hope than numbers. She called vendors, corrected pitch decks, proofread investor emails, and practiced his presentation with him until his voice stopped shaking. When he had his first real meeting downtown, she ironed his only white shirt on a towel because they did not own a board, then stood in the hallway after he left, holding the old apartment key in her palm as if it were a prayer. Caleb returned that night breathless, laughing, lifting her off the floor, saying they had loved the deck, they had loved the vision, they had loved him. Natalie laughed too, because loving him had once meant wanting the room to see him clearly, even when her own fingerprints were on every page. Success did not arrive all at once. It came in small upgrades that looked harmless at first. A better office. A better suit. A better circle of people who learned to say Caleb's name while looking through Natalie as if she were part of the furniture that came with his early years. He stopped saying we in meetings. Then he stopped inviting her to them. At dinners, when investors asked how the company had started, he told the story with charm and speed, trimming her out so cleanly that even Natalie sometimes wondered whether silence had made her disappear. She tried to speak once, gently, adding a detail about the first pitch deck. Caleb placed his hand over hers under the table and squeezed, not affectionately, but as a warning wrapped in manners. Later, in the cab home, he told her those rooms required a certain image, and she should not make everything personal. That was how the marriage began to end, not with a single betrayal, but with careful erasure. By the time he filed for divorce, Caleb had already learned to treat her devotion like an old loan he no longer planned to repay. He said they had grown apart. He said his life had changed. He said she deserved someone who wanted the same quiet future she did. Natalie had stood in their apartment, surrounded by white walls, packed boxes, and the distant sound of Manhattan traffic below, listening to a man describe abandonment as personal growth. She did not beg. She had given too many years to being useful. That night, after he left, she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her bare ring finger until the city lights blurred. Now, inside the Grand Meridian ballroom, the same man sat at the VIP table while Brianna laughed at the version of Natalie he had taught the room to believe. Divorced. Left behind. Uninvited from the future. Natalie watched him accept another glass of champagne from a passing server and smile toward an investor who had once praised a strategy document she wrote at 3 a.m. Caleb looked polished beneath the blue-white lights, but Natalie could still see the young man at the Queen's kitchen table beneath the tuxedo, still hungry to be chosen, still afraid someone would discover how much of his foundation had been built by someone else. A soft round of applause rose as Margaret Sloane introduced the evening's first honoree. Natalie placed her water glass down without a sound. The past had taught her something the room had not yet learned. Being erased was painful, but it was not the same as being gone. The room chose the easier story because easier stories do not ask anyone to feel ashamed. Natalie could sense it spreading across the VIP table after Brianna's first joke, the quick smiles, the lowered eyes, the small glances toward Caleb to see whether he would object. He did not. That was all the permission they needed. The gala continued beneath its elegant lights, all blue silk draping and polished silver, with waiters moving between tables as Margaret Sloane spoke from the stage about leadership, second chances, and the responsibility of influence. The words were beautiful enough to make the room feel noble, and hollow enough to float above the woman being quietly mocked near the back. Brianna waited until applause covered the end of Margaret's introduction, then turned toward an older investor with a voice sweetened for public use. "I have to give Natalie credit," she said. "Most women would not come back to a room after being replaced in it." A few people laughed again, more comfortably this time. One man lifted his eyebrows and said divorce could be the most expensive lesson a founder ever learned. Caleb gave a tight smile, the kind that revealed he disliked the subject only because it might become inconvenient. We all learn, he said, smoothing his cuff. Some chapters simply close. Natalie heard every word from her table. She could have looked away. She could have stepped into the hallway, called a car, and let them keep the version of her that made them feel superior. Instead, she remained seated, her hands folded lightly near the base of her water glass, her face composed beneath the chandelier light. There was a time when Caleb's silence would have reached across a room and broken something inside her. Now it only confirmed what she already knew: he had never protected what did not improve his reflection. Brianna leaned back in her chair, encouraged by the laughter, and let her gaze drift toward Natalie again. I think it is brave, she said, pretending softness. Some people need closure so badly they will sit anywhere just to feel included. This time the laughter came from more than one table. Not loud, not cruel enough to shock the room, but polished and social, the kind of laughter people can deny later because no one raised their voice. Natalie picked up her glass and took a measured sip. The water was cold. The ice touched the rim with a small sound that steadied her. Across the ballroom, the Pierce Meridian logo glowed above the stage, blue and white against the screen displaying the evening's honored initiative. Natalie knew that initiative better than anyone at Caleb's table. She knew the original budget gaps, the misdirected grants, the community partners who had almost walked away, the frontline directors who had been too polite to say the foundation was failing them. Months earlier, she had sat across from Jonathan Pierce in a conference room with no cameras, no applause, and no one calling her anyone's ex-wife. She had told him the truth plainly, and he had listened as if truth were not an inconvenience. The memory passed through her now like a warm hand on her shoulder. At the VIP table, Caleb laughed at something Victor Hayes said, though his eyes flicked toward the empty chair beside Jonathan's nameplate near the stage. Caleb needed Jonathan Pierce tonight. Turner Innovations was seeking capital, and the Pierce Meridian network could open doors Caleb had been knocking on for years. That was why he would not risk correcting Brianna. That was why he would let the room laugh at Natalie as long as the laughter did not threaten the deal he wanted. Natalie lowered her glass and looked toward the stage. Margaret introduced the next segment, a short film about the Social Enterprise Fund and the strategic restructuring that had saved it. The screen filled with images of small businesses, community workshops, and young founders standing in storefronts across the country. People applauded the results without knowing whose quiet work had made the results possible. Natalie did not need them to know. Not yet. She only needed to remember that she was not the woman Brianna described. She was not a leftover chapter. She was not a cautionary tale from Caleb's past. She was the hand behind a future this room had gathered to celebrate. Brianna could laugh. Caleb could stay silent. The room could choose the easier story for a little longer. Truth had a way of waiting until the perfect moment to stand up. After the divorce, Natalie learned that rebuilding did not look beautiful while it was happening. It looked like a rented studio in Boston with one window facing the side of another building, a folding table for a desk, and a mattress on the floor because she refused to spend money before the next invoice cleared. It looked like grocery store soup, second-hand coats, and waking before sunrise because anxiety had become an alarm clock she could not turn off. The first winter away from New York was bitter enough to make every walk feel like a test of will. Wind cut through the streets near the harbor, rattling bare branches and pushing cold air under the hem of her coat as she carried client folders beneath one arm and coffee in the other hand. No one from Caleb's circle called. No one asked what part of his first pitch deck had been hers. No one wondered whether the woman they had watched disappear from his side might still know how to build something. For a while, the silence hurt. Then it became useful. Natalie filled it with work. She accepted projects other consultants avoided because they were too messy, too small, too close to failure. A family bakery chain drowning in vendor debt. A local medical supplier losing contracts because its operations director had hidden delays behind optimistic reports. A nonprofit fund with good intentions and numbers so tangled that donors had begun leaving quietly. Natalie sat at cheap conference tables, community offices, back rooms, and coffee shops with weak Wi-Fi, listening more than she spoke. She asked where the money was really going. She asked who was doing the work no one measured. She asked which reports made executives feel safe while the people closest to the problem were being ignored. Slowly, companies began surviving. Not dramatically. Not overnight. But with cleaner books, better systems, fairer priorities, and leaders who stopped confusing presentation with repair. Her name traveled carefully, one recommendation at a time. Someone told someone else that Natalie Brooks could see the crack in a business before the wall fell. She did not post victories online. She did not write long captions about strength. She bought a real desk after her 5th successful project and a warm lamp after her 7th. She framed nothing. She needed no shrine to prove she had endured. On quiet Sundays, she walked along the Charles River in sneakers, passing runners, dogs, students, and families who knew nothing about Caleb Turner or the marriage that had turned her into a lesson people whispered about over dinner. She liked that anonymity. It gave her room to become someone without being watched. The first time a major chief executive officer requested her directly, she read the email 3 times before answering. Not because she doubted her ability, but because part of her still remembered being spoken over, edited out, thanked privately, and erased publicly. She replied with 2 sentences, professional and calm. By the end of that year, her apartment had bookshelves, a better coffee maker, and a small vase of white flowers she bought every Friday because no one had to send beauty for it to belong to her. Back in the Grand Meridian Ballroom, the charity film ended and applause rose around Natalie like weather passing over glass. Caleb clapped from the VIP table, smiling at the initiative he did not know she had helped restructure. Brianna leaned toward an investor and whispered something that made him glance back again. Natalie did not move. She had rebuilt too much in rooms without witnesses to be undone by laughter in a room full of them. The version of her they mocked had survived cold mornings, unpaid invoices, lonely dinners, and the long discipline of starting again. She was not sitting near the back because she had nowhere else to go. She was sitting there because she had learned that real power did not always enter from the front. Natalie first met Jonathan Pierce in a conference room that had no chandeliers, no cameras, and no one laughing at anyone who had survived a divorce. It was on the 26th floor of the Pierce Meridian building, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Manhattan looked gray through the windows and every person around the table seemed determined to sound more certain than they felt. The Social Enterprise Fund had been losing trust quietly for months. Grants were delayed, community partners were frustrated, reports looked polished but said very little, and the directors kept using words like alignment and impact while avoiding the harder truth that money was not reaching the people it was meant to serve. Natalie sat near the end of the table in a charcoal blazer, her hair pinned back, a blue pen resting beside a folder marked with notes she had written before dawn. She had been invited by a board member who knew her work in Boston, but most of the room treated her like a temporary consultant brought in to decorate a difficult conversation with fresh language. Jonathan did not. He sat at the head of the table in a dark suit, quiet, watchful, his silver cufflinks catching the light only when he turned a page. He did not interrupt the directors as they explained the situation. He let them finish. Then he looked toward Natalie and asked what they were missing. The question was simple. The room shifted because simple questions are dangerous when everyone has been hiding behind complicated answers. Natalie opened her folder and spoke without drama. She said the fund was not failing because the mission was weak. It was failing because the structure rewarded clean reports instead of honest outcomes. She pointed to 3 budget lines where administrative comfort had grown while frontline programs were being asked to do more with less. She described community partners who were too polite to complain directly but had already begun preparing to leave. She explained that the fund did not need a new slogan. It needed accountability, local decision-making, faster disbursement, and the humility to ask people closest to the work what they actually needed. No one smiled. A senior director leaned back and folded his arms. Someone else clicked a pen too loudly. Natalie kept her voice even. She had learned long ago that truth did not become stronger when it was dressed in anger. Jonathan listened to every word. He did not soften her points to make the room comfortable. He did not repeat her ideas as if they had become valuable only after passing through his voice. When she finished, he looked down at the report, closed it, and said, "Then we rebuild the fund around the people it was supposed to protect." That was the first time in years Natalie felt a powerful man choose the truth over his own reflection. After the meeting, he found her near the elevator, holding 2 paper cups of coffee from the office kitchen. He handed one to her and said she had not made the room feel accused. She had made the problem feel possible to solve. Natalie remembered that because it was the kind of compliment that respected the work instead of trying to own the woman behind it. Over the next months, their conversations moved from boardrooms to late strategy calls, then to quiet dinners after long days, then to Sunday walks when the city felt briefly less hungry. Jonathan learned that she hated being interrupted, loved plain coffee, and kept white flowers on her desk every Friday. Natalie learned that he read every line of every document, remembered the names of junior staff, and never confused softness with weakness. He did not rescue her. She had already saved herself. He simply stood beside the life she had rebuilt, and treated it like something worthy of reverence. Back in the Grand Meridian Ballroom, applause rose again for the initiative Jonathan's company was honoring. Caleb clapped because he needed the room. Brianna smiled because she believed she understood the room. Natalie sat near the back, knowing Jonathan Pierce had once seen her clearly before the world had been given a reason to look. Natalie and Jonathan married on a quiet September afternoon in Vermont, far from marble ballrooms, gala lights, and the kind of people who treated love like a headline. The ceremony took place behind a small inn near a lake, where the grass was still damp from morning rain and the maple leaves had just begun turning red at the edges. There were 12 guests, 2 rows of wooden chairs, a local judge with kind eyes, and a breeze gentle enough to move the white ribbon tied around Natalie's bouquet. She wore an ivory dress with long sleeves and no train, simple enough that she could walk across the lawn without anyone adjusting it. Jonathan wore a dark suit, not because he could not have filled the hillside with security, cameras, and famous names, but because he understood that Natalie had spent too many years being watched by people who did not truly see her. When he took her hands, he did not look proud in the way powerful men often look proud when the world gave them something beautiful. He looked grateful. That was what made her throat tighten. The vows were short. The silence afterward was deep. For once, no one was waiting to measure her against her past. No one whispered divorced woman like a verdict. No one looked around for Caleb's reaction. Jonathan's thumb moved once across her knuckles, steady and warm, and Natalie felt something inside her finally stop bracing for disappointment. They spent the evening at a long table inside the inn, eating roasted chicken, garden vegetables, warm bread, and apple cake served with coffee. Jonathan's mother cried quietly during dessert. Natalie laughed when one of his oldest friends gave a toast so sincere it nearly embarrassed everyone in the room. Later, by the lake, Jonathan asked if she wanted the marriage announced through Pierce Meridian's communications office. He was not pressuring her. He was offering protection in the form most people in his world understood: visibility, status, proof. Natalie looked across the water, where the moon had broken into silver pieces, and said not yet. She was not ashamed of him. She was not hiding. She simply wanted one part of her life to grow in peace before the world learned how to discuss it. Jonathan accepted that without a shadow crossing his face. He kissed her hand and said, "Then we keep it ours." Months later, when the invitation to the Pierce Meridian Charity Gala arrived, Natalie opened it at the kitchen counter of their home in Manhattan while Jonathan was on a call in his study. The envelope was elegant, the kind sent to donors, advisors, investors, and people whose presence made photographs look more important. Her name was printed alone: Ms. Natalie Brooks. She stood there for a while, hearing the city traffic far below and the soft murmur of Jonathan's voice through the closed door. She knew Caleb would attend. Turner Innovations needed access to Jonathan's network, and Caleb had never walked away from A room where money might applaud him. She also knew Brianna would be there, polished and bright, eager to turn Natalie into proof that Caleb had upgraded his life. When Jonathan found her, the invitation was still open beside her coffee. He read it, then looked at her with the quiet patience she trusted. "Do you want me to go in with you?" he asked. Natalie thought of the VIP tables, the old glances, the people who had accepted Caleb's version because it was easier than questioning him. She thought of the empty space after the divorce, the Boston mornings, the work that had made her whole before anyone called her wife again. "No," she said softly. "I want to walk in alone." Jonathan understood before she explained. This was not pride. It was closure. He would arrive later, after a board call he could not move, and she would face the room first as herself, without a title standing beside her like a shield. Now, seated near the back of the Grand Meridian ballroom while laughter moved through the VIP table, Natalie touched the thin wedding band she had turned inward beneath her fingers. The ring was there, warm against her skin, hidden from every person who thought they knew the ending. She did not need to show it yet. Some truths were stronger when they waited. The joke went too far because Brianna finally mistook silence for consent. Natalie had let the first comments pass, then the second, then the polished laughter that moved from one table to another like a glass being filled too often. She had listened while Margaret Sloan guided the gala through its program, while donors applauded photographs of young founders, while Caleb sat beneath the blue-white glow of the Pierce Meridian logo pretending the woman near the back had nothing to do with the future he wanted. For most of the evening, Natalie remained still. She kept her shoulders relaxed, her hands folded, her wedding band turned inward beneath her fingers, hidden in the shadow of her palm. But Brianna was not satisfied with wounding someone quietly. She wanted the room to notice her doing it. When the short film ended and applause softened into conversation, Brianna stood at the VIP table with a champagne glass raised, her pale gold dress catching the light as if the ballroom had been designed around her reflection. She smiled toward the guests first, then toward Caleb, then let her gaze drift to Natalie with the lazy confidence of a woman who believed status could make cruelty sound charming. "Before the next speaker," Brianna said lightly, "I just want to acknowledge how brave it is when someone can sit in a room after being replaced and still pretend not to be uncomfortable." A few guests laughed too quickly. Others looked down at their plates. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he did not rise. He did not reach for the microphone. He did not say her name with respect. He only gave that small, embarrassed smile powerful men use when they want cruelty to end without costing them approval. Natalie looked at him across the room and saw the whole marriage in that one expression. The unwillingness to defend her when defense might inconvenience him. The quiet request that she absorb humiliation gracefully so he could remain admired. Brianna continued, encouraged by the silence. "Honestly, I think we should all learn from Natalie," she said. "Some women cling to old chapters. Others have the grace to let successful men move forward." This time, the laughter was thinner, less certain, but still present. Victor Hayes shifted at the VIP table and looked toward Caleb as if waiting for him to draw a line. Caleb reached for his water instead. Natalie set her own glass down. The sound was soft, almost swallowed by the room, but it marked the end of something. She lifted the napkin from her lap, folded it once, and placed it beside her plate. She was not leaving because she had been defeated. She was leaving because peace was not something she owed to people committed to misunderstanding her. Near the stage, Margaret Sloan glanced toward the entrance, then paused in the middle of reading the next donor introduction. A subtle shift moved through the ballroom before anyone announced it. Conversations thinned. A security attendant near the double doors straightened. Then Jonathan Pierce entered quietly, late enough that his absence had become a question and his arrival became the answer. He wore a dark tailored suit, no unnecessary display, no entourage beyond one assistant who remained by the door. His presence did not need volume. It changed the air by occupying it completely. Several guests stood at once. Caleb stood faster than the rest, his chair scraping softly against the floor as opportunity replaced discomfort in his eyes. Brianna's smile transformed with remarkable speed, smoothing itself into elegance, as if the last minute had not happened. Natalie remained seated for one heartbeat longer. Jonathan's gaze crossed the room and found her immediately. Not Caleb. Not the investors. Not the stage. Her. The quiet recognition in his face was so steady, so intimate, that for the first time all night, the people nearest Natalie stopped looking at her as a woman to pity and began wondering what they had missed. Caleb stepped into the aisle, ready to greet the man whose investment he wanted more than pride, but Jonathan did not move toward him first. He looked at Natalie's folded napkin, at her composed face, at the way she had prepared to leave a room that had not earned her presence. Then his expression cooled. The laughter that had followed her all evening vanished so completely it felt as if the chandeliers themselves had gone still. Jonathan Pierce did not hurry across the ballroom, and that made every step feel heavier than if he had rushed. Caleb was already moving toward him with his practiced founder's smile, one hand extended, his posture rearranged into confidence as if the last few minutes had not exposed him. "Mr. Pierce," Caleb said warmly, loud enough for the nearest investors to hear. "We are honored you could make it. I was hoping we could speak tonight about Turner Innovations and the partnership proposal." Jonathan looked at the extended hand for one brief second, then at Caleb's face, and the pause was clean enough to make the air tighten. He shook Caleb's hand with formal restraint, but his attention did not stay there. It moved past him to the table near the back, where Natalie had risen halfway from her chair, the folded napkin beside her plate, her expression calm but tired in a way Jonathan knew too well. He had seen that look only a few times before, usually when she had chosen silence because the room did not deserve the cost of her explanation. Brianna stepped forward before Caleb could recover, smiling with the polished brightness of a woman who believed charm could erase cruelty if applied quickly enough. "Mr. Pierce, it is such a pleasure," she said. "You came at the perfect time. We were just having a little fun with Caleb's ex-wife. You know how these old social situations can be." A few people at the VIP table went still. Victor Hayes lowered his glass. Margaret Sloane, still near the stage, stopped turning the page in her program. Jonathan's expression changed almost imperceptibly, but Natalie saw it from across the room. It was not anger in the loud sense. It was disappointment sharpened into something colder. He turned fully toward Brianna. "A little fun," he repeated. His voice was quiet, and somehow that made it impossible to ignore. Brianna's smile faltered, then tried to repair itself. "I only meant she has been very brave tonight. It cannot be easy attending an event after a divorce, especially when Caleb has moved on so publicly." Caleb stepped in quickly. "Brianna means no harm. Natalie and I have history, of course, but everyone here respects her." The lie landed badly because too many people had laughed. Jonathan looked at Caleb then, and for the first time that evening, Caleb seemed to understand that silence could become evidence. "If respect was present," Jonathan said. "I did not hear it." The words moved across the nearest tables with the precision of a door closing. Caleb's smile thinned. Brianna looked toward the investors, searching for support, but no one offered it. Jonathan turned away from both of them and walked toward Natalie. He did not look around for approval. He did not perform outrage. He crossed the ballroom as if the only person in the room who mattered had been waiting too long to be treated properly. Natalie stood when he reached her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The chandeliers glowed above them, blue-white light resting on her navy dress, on the ring she had kept turned inward, on the glass of water she had barely touched. Jonathan noticed the ring immediately, and so did the people closest to them when he gently reached for her hand and turned it palm down between both of his. The thin gold band caught the light. A whisper moved through the room before anyone dared ask the question. Brianna's face lost its careful color. Caleb's eyes fixed on their joined hands, his expression shifting from confusion to calculation to something painfully close to fear. Jonathan faced the room, still holding Natalie's hand, and spoke clearly enough for the back tables to hear. "You are speaking about my wife." No one laughed. The sentence did not need volume to change everything. It passed through the ballroom and stripped the evening of its easy cruelty. The woman they had placed near the back was not an abandoned chapter from Caleb's life. She was the wife of the chief executive officer whose name glowed above the stage, the man whose investment Caleb had spent months trying to reach. But Jonathan did not stop there for status, and that was what made the moment even sharper. He looked toward Margaret Sloane and gave a slight nod. Margaret stepped to the microphone, her face composed but moved by the justice of the timing. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "before we continue, it is only appropriate to acknowledge the strategists whose work made tonight's honored initiative possible. The restructuring plan that saved the Pierce Meridian Social Enterprise Fund was led by Natalie Brooks." The silence deepened into recognition. Victor Hayes closed his eyes briefly, as if remembering too late where he had seen her name. An investor at Caleb's table looked down at the program in front of him, suddenly reading the fine print. Brianna sat slowly, no longer bright, no longer certain. Caleb remained standing in the aisle, surrounded by everything he had wanted from the room and unable to touch any of it. Natalie did not smile. She did not need triumph to confirm what truth had already done. Jonathan lowered his voice so only she could hear. "Are you ready to leave?" Natalie looked once at the VIP table, at the laughter that had vanished, at the people now rearranging their faces into regret. Then she looked back at him, and for the first time that night, her shoulders softened. "Yes," she said. And the room watched as the woman they had mocked walked forward, not rescued, not displayed, but recognized. The ballroom remained silent behind Natalie and Jonathan as they walked toward the doors, but it was not the same silence that had followed her earlier in the evening. That first silence had been cruel, full of people waiting to see whether she would shrink. This one carried recognition, shame, and the slow understanding that the joke had cost more than anyone intended to pay. Jonathan did not pull her away. He did not hurry. His hand rested lightly at the small of her back, a gesture steady enough to feel protective without making her look protected. Natalie moved beside him with her head lifted, her navy dress catching the chandelier light, her wedding band no longer hidden. At the VIP table, Brianna sat perfectly still, her champagne untouched, her bright confidence reduced to something fragile and colorless. Caleb stood in the aisle as if the room had taken his future and placed it just beyond reach. Investors who had laughed with him minutes before now avoided his eyes. Victor Hayes looked down at the program again, reading Natalie's name beneath the Social Enterprise Initiative, finally connecting the woman he had dismissed to the work he had just applauded. Near the ballroom entrance, Caleb found his voice. "Natalie," he said, low enough to sound private, but the room was too quiet for privacy. She paused, not because he deserved her attention, but because leaving without fear meant she could choose the last moment. Jonathan stopped beside her and waited. He did not speak for her. Caleb stepped closer, his face arranged into regret too late to be trusted. "I did not know," he said. Natalie looked at him calmly. There it was again, the defense of men who only regretted what ignorance had cost them. He had not known she was Jonathan Pierce's wife. He had not known she had led the restructuring plan. He had not known the room would turn against him when truth arrived. But he had known she was being mocked. He had known Brianna was making her pain into entertainment. He had known silence would keep him comfortable, and he had chosen it anyway. "You knew enough," Natalie said. Her voice was quiet, but it reached the people nearest them with perfect clarity. Caleb's mouth tightened. "Brianna went too far," he said, trying to move the blame away from himself. Natalie glanced once toward the table where Brianna sat looking smaller than her expensive dress. "She went as far as your silence allowed." The sentence settled between them like a door closing. Caleb looked at Jonathan then, perhaps hoping for a business conversation, perhaps trying to rescue what remained of the partnership he had imagined. Jonathan's expression gave him nothing useful. "Turner Innovations will be reviewed on merit," Jonathan said evenly. "And leadership is part of merit. No threat. No anger. No performance. Just a standard Caleb could not charm his way around." Natalie felt the final thread loosen inside her. For years, some part of her had wanted the room to understand. Not because she needed applause, but because being erased had made her wonder whether truth mattered if no one saw it. Now she understood something gentler and more freeing. Truth had mattered even when no one clapped. It had mattered in the Boston apartment, in the difficult client meetings, in the white flowers she bought for herself, in the quiet Vermont vows, in every morning she chose to live without asking the past for permission. Margaret Sloane returned to the microphone inside the ballroom, her voice composed as she guided the gala forward. The event continued, but the laughter did not return. Natalie and Jonathan stepped into the marble corridor where the music softened behind closed doors and Manhattan glittered beyond tall windows. For the first time that night, Natalie breathed fully. Jonathan looked at her with concern that did not crowd her. "Are you all right?" he asked. Natalie looked back through the glass for one brief second, at the room that had tried to turn her into a cautionary tale, and had instead been forced to see her whole. Then she turned away. "I am," she said. Outside, the city air was cool, and the avenues shimmered with headlights, rain-dark pavement, and the silver movement of late-night traffic. Jonathan offered his arm, and Natalie took it, not because she needed help standing, but because walking beside someone who honored her no longer felt like losing herself. Behind them, Caleb remained in the ballroom with his investors, his fiancée, and the silence his choices had earned. Natalie carried none of it with her. She did not need the room to stop laughing. She only needed to stop caring whether it did.